Fate is defined as the development of events beyond a person's control. And certainly, what can be said to be a horrible fate isn't always synonymous with someone's tragic passing. So in this video, we're going to look at some wildly strange circumstances that I think you'll find are truly horrible. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Martin Pistorius was born to Joan and Rodney Pistorius on the last day of December in 1975. He was bright and charismatic even as a toddler and developed a passion for computers and electronics early on. Before his 10th birthday, he built an alarm system to warn him when his brother got into his Legos. Then at 11, he safely repaired a broken electrical socket in the family's home. At that point in time, it looked like he had an incredibly bright future ahead of him, but then only a year later when he was 12, Martin came home from school one day with a headache and a worsening fever. Martin's family initially assumed he'd just come down with a severe but otherwise regular flu. That night, he slept in the fetal position until the following morning, and then when he woke up, rather than getting better, his condition had worsened and he completely refused to eat. Then, over the course of the day, he became sicker and more lethargic, which again wouldn't be too uncommon for the flu, but then he had a series of severe and profuse nosebleeds. It was at this point that his parents worried that this was more than just a flu and brought him to the hospital. Doctors first checked for common sicknesses and vitamin deficiencies, but these turned up nothing. Then they ran a series of more specific tests, and one of the more obscure tests they ran came back positive for something known as cryptococcal meningitis. This is a rare fungal infection that causes inflammation in the brain and central nervous system. Martin's parents didn't really know what to make of it, and all they could really do was hold out hope that doctors would be able to stop the potentially serious illness in its tracks. But despite round-the-clock treatment, Martin's condition continued to worsen, and slowly he lost all motor skills, then the ability to speak, and then he slipped into a coma. And once he was in the coma, doctors told his parents that the odds of him regaining consciousness were slim to none. Under the circumstances, the best they could do was take him home and make him as comfortable as possible until he passed away. Everyone assumed this would come swiftly, but even in the meantime, the family's lives were thrown into chaos. Each night, Martin's father woke up every 2 hours to turn Martin so he wouldn't get painful bed sores. Then he'd get up at 5 a.m., dress Martin, load him into the car, and drive him to a special care center where he'd spend the next 8 hours. After a long day of work, he'd pick him up, drive him back home, bathe him, feed him, and put him to bed, after which the process would start all over again. This grueling schedule continued for 2 years, during which time Martin was completely immobile and unconscious. But then, unbeknownst to anyone, a slow recovery began in the early 90s when Martin was 15 or 16 years old. Initially, he was only able to sense people moving around in his room and talking. But soon enough, in addition to hearing, he also regained the ability to understand discussions going on around him. In this conscious state, without anyone realizing it was happening, Martin was learning about major historical events, like that Nelson Mandela had been sworn in as South Africa's first black president in the spring of 1994, and that Princess Diana had died in a car crash in the summer of 1997. Unfortunately, although Martin's brain was undergoing a remarkable awakening, he still couldn't move his body even slightly, so everyone assumed that his condition was no different than it had been when he slipped into the coma. By then, the stress, uncertainty, and sleepless nights had taken their toll on his family. This was particularly true for his mother Joan, who started to crack under the immense pressure. One day, when she had reached the absolute limit of devastation and exhaustion, and with no end in sight, she sat by her son's bedside and said out loud that she hoped he died. She didn't know it at the time, but Martin heard and understood those horrible words that were uttered by the one person who should have loved him more than anyone else. At that moment, he felt totally hopeless and totally alone. To make matters worse, a few of the staff members at the care center were neglecting him and treating him poorly both verbally and physically. In one instance, he was given tea which was scalding hot and burned his throat. In another, he was left unattended in a freezing bath for what seemed like an eternity. He was also often parked in front of a TV which played nothing but Barney reruns for hours on end. Thankfully, a few of the caregivers were kind and patient, but he was still trapped in an unimaginable mental prison. Eventually, to pass the time and cope with the incredible boredom, he began having conversations with imaginary people, much like a young child would do. Then, one evening, as his father got him ready for bed, Martin felt like his heart was about to pound out of his chest. He wanted to scream at the top of his lungs to tell his father that he was alive and aware, but he couldn't, and his father just kept going through the motions as if he was on autopilot. Then, the worst reality of all hit home. He was still a very young man, and if his body held out, he might spend another 5, 6, or even 7 decades trapped like this. In the end, this became too much to bear, and he taught himself to tune out of reality entirely. Unfortunately, deep down, he knew that this was only a short-term solution to what might be a long-term problem. What he needed was something positive to occupy his mind, something that could give him a sense of worth, and more importantly, some control in a world where very little existed. He started by teaching himself to tell the time by tracking the sunlight as it moved across the room. It didn't happen overnight, but this simple ritual helped Martin regain some control and re-examine his situation. Eventually, he even accepted what his mother said because he was able to see the situation from her perspective. He realized that when she looked at him, she only saw a lifeless, empty shell where there had once been an active, affectionate, and intelligent son. As time went on, Martin continued to regain consciousness and the use of his body, but improvements came in painfully small increments. Nonetheless, he persisted and soon was able to make small movements with his eyes and fingers that he hoped would eventually be seen by his parents or caregivers. Martin knew it was a long shot, but then one day it finally happened. A therapist named Verna noticed what she thought were small reactions when she spoke to him. Initially, she wasn't sure if she'd actually seen something or just imagined it, but she told Martin's doctors anyway, and they agreed to send him to the University of Pretoria's Center for Augmentative and Alternative Communications for a thorough analysis. Martin was 25 when he arrived at the University of Pretoria, and by then, he'd been trapped in an unconscious state for more than a decade. Shortly after his arrival, doctors confirmed what Verna had suspected, that Martin was aware. His mother promptly quit her job and dedicated herself to aiding his recovery in any way possible. His family then bought him a computer with specialized text-to-speech software that allowed Martin to communicate effectively for the first time since he was a teenager. Initially, he could only manage simple statements like, "I'm cold" or "I want toast," but it was still far better than the prison he was in before. And then eventually, he mastered the new form of communication, and with an electric wheelchair and slowly improving motor skills, he even landed a job filing papers at a government office. Incredibly, that was just the beginning. Martin later started his own web design firm, went to college, and met an Englishwoman named Joanna, who he married in 2009. He was still confined to a wheelchair and couldn't speak, but he and Joanna moved to the UK later that year. Since then, he's co-written an account of his harrowing ordeal called Ghost Boy, which was published in 2011. He also spoke at a TEDx event in the US and was featured on a national public radio podcast, and in December of 2018, his wife gave birth to a healthy baby boy. It's not clear why Martin awoke from his coma when he did, but without Verna's care and attention, he thinks he still might be wasting away in that care center. Cameron Robbins was born in Abilene, Texas on November 1st, 2004. A few days later, he was adopted by a loving family from Louisiana that raised him for the next 18 years. It's not clear why he didn't stay with his biological family, but by all accounts, he adapted quickly to his new life and surroundings. Cameron began attending the University Lab School in Baton Rouge as a kindergartner and studied there until graduating from high school on May 21st of this year. Known for his perpetual smile, positive attitude, and unruly hair, Cameron was a diligent and well-liked student. He was also a 3-year varsity letterman on the school's baseball team, who often played with injuries that would have sidelined less dedicated teammates. After graduating and to enjoy one last celebration before moving on to the next stage of their lives, Cameron and his friend group from school signed up for a trip to the Bahamas. It wasn't an official school event, but nearly everyone stayed together in the Atlantis Paradise Resort in Nassau anyway. On the evening of May 24th, Cameron and his friends boarded a 500-ton Spanish galleon replica and set off on what was supposed to be a fun, safe, and memorable cruise. According to the company that owns the boat, it's the only pirate-themed charter in the Bahamas. However, it's one of many similar so-called booze cruises that cater to travelers who aren't old enough to drink in their home countries. Since the legal drinking age in the Bahamas is just 18, many of these booze cruise tickets often include alcohol. Nobody knows how much Cameron and his friends had to drink that night, but at just after 9:30 p.m., someone dared him to jump off the boat and into the water. Unfortunately, Cameron definitely wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Even worse, he may not have known that the warm waters around the Bahamas are home to a number of species of shark, one of which is the tiger shark, which is second only to the white shark for the number of attacks on humans. Whether or not he was oblivious to the dangers lurking below or just wasn't thinking clearly due to the alcohol he'd consumed, Cameron accepted the dare. Pretty quickly, he stripped down to his boxer shorts, gave his friends a quick goodbye, and then jumped from the boat just off the coast of Atoll Island, northeast of Nassau. After splashing down in the water, Cameron resurfaced just a few meters away from the side of the ship. Within moments, the crew initiated the man overboard protocol, and someone tossed a life ring into the water for him to grab onto, and immediately other people on board yelled for him to swim to the life ring. Down in the water, Cameron didn't reply and seemed to be focused on a silver figure disturbing the water just a few feet in front of him. Whatever it was, Cameron seemed to be looking directly at it. In the next second, he turned away from whatever it was in the water and started going in the opposite direction, but not toward the life ring either. At the same time, with the boat still moving, Cameron was quickly becoming smaller and smaller in the distance. This was the last time Cameron was ever seen. As soon as he was out of view, the boat, which was previously loud and celebrating, went completely silent. The incident was quickly reported to the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, but it wasn't until 11:30 p.m. when they contacted the US Coast Guard headquarters in Miami to start a search. Right away, they deployed boats and aircraft that collectively searched a 300 square mile area for multiple days, during which no trace of Cameron was ever found. The Royal Bahamas Defense Force officially halted its search and rescue operations on May 27th, and the US Coast Guard continued searching for a little while longer, but it called off its efforts as well a few weeks later. After his disappearance, the shark attack theory gained momentum when a video of the incident began showing up online and in news broadcasts. It does make for a more dramatic story, but many marine biologists and oceanographers don't think he had an encounter with a shark or any other large predator because despite these animals living in the water, attacks are still exceedingly rare. In fact, there were only 4 shark attacks reported in the Bahamas between 2006 and 2016, and only one of them was fatal. At the same time, however, it's well known that fish tend to congregate around boats like the one Cameron jumped off of because food and other edible waste is often tossed overboard. It's possible that Cameron entered the water at a particularly inopportune time when a large, hungry shark just happened to be in the area looking for smaller fish to eat. Another factor worth considering is the water temperature, which was somewhere between 75 and 82 Fahrenheit, or between 23 and 27 Celsius that evening. Even though the low end of that range might sound warm enough, hypothermia can't be ruled out because the water was significantly cooler than Cameron's internal temperature. In addition, the alcohol in his system would have caused his blood vessels to dilate and caused his body to cool down more quickly. Finally, it's possible that he simply succumbed to exhaustion as he waited for rescue and eventually was no longer able to tread water. In the end, it's hard to say exactly what happened to Cameron, other than that his last moments treading water in the dark ocean had to be truly terrifying. Imagine being so ravenous that no amount of food could satisfy your hunger. At the same time, imagine being hopelessly poor and having to consume everything from stones and garbage to medical waste and live animals just to fill your empty stomach. Believe it or not, this was the life of a Frenchman named Terrer. Terrer was born sometime around 1772, and even as a child, he had an appetite of epic proportions. Already, by the time he was a teenager, he could eat close to his weight in beef in a single day, and his parents could no longer afford to feed him. This forced him to leave home and move to Paris in the late 1780s, after which times were tough, and he quickly fell in with a group of performers, beggars, and pickpockets who roamed the city's streets. Soon enough, though, Terrer realized that people would pay to watch him eat all sorts of odd and inedible objects. This apparently included stones, corks, live animals, and even an entire basket full of apples swallowed whole, one after the other. Some of these specific instances may have been fabricated or embellished over time, but there's little doubt that Terrer regularly ate enormous quantities of odd items. Unsurprisingly, on several occasions, this landed him in hospitals with severe intestinal issues that could only be treated with harsh laxatives. But Terrer was resilient and always managed to recover, and his bizarre condition stayed with him throughout his life and never seemed to give him a moment's peace. Although there aren't any pictures of him, he's said to have had particularly soft hair and relatively normal facial features. He also had a massive tongue, a huge jaw that opened like a trapdoor, and an oversized mouth nearly 4 inches wide. Supposedly, Terrer's stretched out cheeks could hold a dozen eggs or nearly as many apples, but he couldn't gain weight no matter what or how much he ate. And although he only weighed 100 pounds at the age of 17, loose skin hung in great folds around his jowls and midsection when his stomach wasn't full. He would then inflate almost like a balloon after gorging himself on whatever he could find. Afterward, he'd become extremely lethargic and fall into a deep sleep, during which he'd make chewing and swallowing motions with his mouth while passing noxious gas from both ends. He also seemed to have the ability to keep nearly everything down without vomiting, but struggled with chronic diarrhea that one doctor described as fetid beyond all conception. In addition, he was known to sweat profusely and have such bad body odor that no one could stand to be anywhere near him. Apparently, these conditions also became far worse after he'd eaten. At the same time, Terrer didn't exhibit any other unusual behavior, and his insatiable appetite, body odor, and fine hair suggest that he might have suffered from something as simple as hyperthyroidism. Another theory is that he might have had polyphagia caused by a damaged amygdala, which is a part of the brain. Polyphagia sufferers also tend to have constant hunger that no amount of food seems to satiate. Like many young Frenchmen, Terrer joined the Revolutionary Army when the War of the First Coalition broke out in 1792. But life in the army was difficult, largely because he never got enough to eat. His military rations didn't make even the slightest dent in his appetite, so he resorted to doing odd jobs for other soldiers in exchange for a portion of their food. But again, even this wasn't enough, and he often resorted to eating discarded food scraps, garbage, and whatever else he could find. In a matter of months, his health deteriorated to such an extent that he was given 4 times the standard rations. And despite this, he was eventually admitted to a hospital because even this didn't provide the energy necessary for him to carry out even basic tasks. Eventually, 2 of the army's physicians became fascinated with his case and set out to figure out exactly what was going on. Their first task was to determine whether or not this was real or if he was making it up to avoid being sent to the front lines. To test their theory, they presented Terrer with a meal that had been prepared for over a dozen laborers. They reasoned that if he could eat 2 large meat pies and 4 gallons of milk meant for 15 men without vomiting, it would prove that they were dealing with a genuine medical condition. Unsurprisingly, Terrer devoured every bit of the meal in record time and then went on to swallow a bunch of cooking grease in addition to the rest of the food and promptly fell into a deep sleep. With enough rest and abundant food, Terrer eventually made a partial recovery, and the doctors allowed him to remain in the hospital long after his condition improved. Unfortunately, soldiers were in short supply, and Terrer's superiors requested that he be released for general service. Since the doctor wasn't crazy about losing his most interesting patient, he came up with a plan that would allow him to continue his observations while also taking advantage of Terrer's unusual circumstances. His plan was to have him eat a small wooden box containing a written message. If the contents passed through his digestive system intact, Terrer could be used to deliver sensitive messages near the front lines or maybe even in enemy territory. And even if he was captured, there was almost no chance of this hidden message falling into the wrong hands. To demonstrate this idea, the doctor had Terrer eat a wooden box with a message inside in front of a number of high-ranking officers, after which he was rewarded with a wheelbarrow full of raw bull organs that he devoured completely. 2 days later, when he passed the box, the commanders were pleased to discover that the message was still perfectly legible. Terrer was then tasked with carrying an important message to a French colonel who'd been captured by the Prussians. When it was time to leave, he dressed as a German peasant, ate the box, and crossed into Prussia under the cover of darkness. Unfortunately, his inability to speak the native language quickly aroused suspicions, and he was promptly captured by Prussian authorities. Initially, he didn't reveal his mission despite harsh interrogation methods, and since nothing incriminating was found in his possession, authorities had little to go on. He was, however, sent to prison for further questioning, and he eventually cracked in just a few days after becoming frantic with hunger. Terrer was then chained to a latrine while they waited for the box to pass. When it did, the Prussians supposedly opened it up and found that the message was actually a dummy message that was only supposed to be a confirmation that their plan would work. Other sources claim that Terrer passed the box while his guards were busy with other duties and that he re-ate it before it could be retrieved. Whatever the case, he was sentenced to death and taken to the gallows. In a last-minute decision, though, the commander decided that he would only receive a beating instead, after which time he was released back near the French front line. After having barely escaped death in enemy territory, Terrer was determined to avoid further military service at all costs. After entering France, he went straight to the hospital and told the doctor he'd subject himself to any test or radical cure as long as he didn't have to be a soldier. The doctor agreed and wanted to try anything and everything like tobacco pills or strict diets of boiled eggs and vinegar, but nothing worked. During this time, Terrer was forbidden from eating anything other than what was fed to him, but he often snuck out of his room to scavenge garbage piles or butcher shop waste bins. On more than one occasion as well, he was caught inside the hospital drinking blood from bloodletting patients and suspiciously entering the morgue. The doctor remained hopeful that he could find some sort of cure, but his colleagues were convinced that Terrer should be permanently locked away in an asylum. He did manage to convince them for a time that the condition was physiological and that a cure could be found, but this was then quickly abandoned when a 14-month-old child disappeared from the hospital under mysterious circumstances. It's unclear whether or not Terrer had anything to do with this, but at about the same time, he fled the hospital and never returned. Years later, in 1798, the doctor was informed by a colleague that Terrer was at a hospital in Versailles and that he was in very poor condition and wanted to see him. When the doctor arrived, Terrer told him that he'd swallowed a gold fork 2 years earlier and that he believed it was lodged somewhere in his digestive system. The doctor examined him, thinking the fork was the issue, but upon further examination, realized that Terrer was suffering from advanced tuberculosis, from which there would be no recovery. Terrer passed away a few months later after a bout of diarrhea that left him bedridden, weak, and severely dehydrated. The doctor's colleague went on to perform an autopsy because he was curious about what he might find. The autopsy did reveal that Terrer's mouth and throat were much wider than normal. In addition to that, his body looked as if it was in a permanent state of infection for years. His gallbladder and liver were abnormally large, and his stomach was massive and covered in ulcers. In the end, the autopsy didn't reveal the cause of Terrer's condition, the gold fork was never found, and the legend of Terrer still lives on more than 2 centuries after his death. Hello everyone, my name is Sean and welcome to Scary Interesting. If you enjoyed this video, this is part of a series, so you might want to check out the other videos in the series. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to send it to the email found in the description or submit it to the Scary Interesting subreddit. We also have a Scary Interesting Discord, which I will link in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.